perspective. So ideally, if you can put up your hand and then we'll call on you to speak. That's probably the best way to do it, but you're also welcome to use the chat feature as well. Okay, I think we have a pretty big group that's joined now, so we'll get started. So this session is a good chance to hear from senior leaders in the executive research and executive search space. And it really builds on the last session we had with David Butter. So it's really looking at sort of life beyond the checklist, and how do we have effective and collaborative conversations with candidates. So how do we build rapport with them? How do we learn what makes them tick? And how do we build quality relationships with candidates? And obviously candidates are potential clients over time as well, and that level of candidate care is one thing that really differentiates executive search from contingent recruitment, for example. So I'm very delighted to welcome our panel, and I'm going to start by asking each of them to introduce themselves, which firm they're with, and a little bit about their role and where they are too, because that's an interesting feature too. So we'll go alphabetically. So Sarah, we'll start with you.
Hi, thanks, Patrick. So my name is Sarah Grant. I'm a senior executive search consultant with an amazing little boutique consulting research firm called Harbor West Consulting, located in North Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. And for those of you international people tuning in, if you don't know where that is, it's really close to Whistler. We're right down the road. You drive right through North Vancouver to get to Whistler. So if you're an Olympic fan or a ski fan, you may be familiar with Whistler. Primarily, our firm focuses on public sector, nonprofit, and post-secondary institution searches, executive searches. And I have an amazing team of people that I get to work with every single day. And hopefully some of them are tuning in and excited to share with you today. Thanks, Patrick.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Kelly.
Thanks, Patrick. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Griffin. I'm from Kincannon and Reed. We are actually a search firm that focuses on the food value chain, so food and agriculture, so a bit of a niche. I am located in Chicago. However, we are global. We are on 4 continents, and we are actually remote. So we get to hire the best people no matter where they're seated. I am the vice president of search delivery, which essentially means I'm the head of operations. I'm very excited about being here. I'm very excited to talk to all of you, and I am encouraging all of you to ask as many questions because we're happy to answer them. So thank you for your time today.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. Vishnu.
Thanks, Patrick. Kia ora koutou katoa. Greetings from New Zealand and the coolest little capital city in the world, Wellington. I'm the partner and head of research for a boutique search firm, iCore Leadership Search. Been with the organization, started out as a researcher, now I'm a key shareholder. It's been quite a journey. Really, really pleased to be here. We do a whole lot of work with the public sector, the private sector, the not-for-profit areas. So quite a range of work. We call ourselves specialist generalists, if you will. If such a category exists, but delighted to be here and to be able to share, whatever learnings we've had over the years with all of you. And can I just congratulate you all on surviving both days, and hopefully this particular panel discussion will bring some added value to your lives and respective careers.
Brilliant. Thank you. And before we get started on our focus questions, actually, Kelly, I want to ask you about the virtual. You mentioned that Kincannon Reed is a virtual organization, and as I understand it, it's always been virtual. So that's quite unique, I think. And so maybe you could briefly talk about, how did that position you for the COVID pandemic, but also what changed? Did anything change over that period for you, or was it business as usual? I guess it was new for the candidates.
Yeah, no, so great question. So I came from an environment previously where you were in the office every day. So I jumped at the opportunity to join. Well, that was one of the reasons, right? I jumped at the opportunity to join Kincannon and Reed. But we've been remote for about 15 years. And I think what that allows you to do is to hire the best talent everywhere, like I said before. But I think what was interesting for us was when the pandemic hit, we really didn't have to flex. So we were at an advantage. But I do think what we began to do differently is more of this, right? Video calls. Everything previously was over the phone and we met in person. Now during COVID, you had to be much more intentional about how you communicated, how you onboarded, how you talked to people, because you couldn't meet in person, right? So it does work. It's a lot of work and it can be isolating. And don't get me wrong, there are days I would love to go to an office. And I know some of you think why, but I do think I do truly think there's a lot of value in the office atmosphere. And I do think it's a great place to learn. I'll just say that. If I didn't have that early in my career, I don't think I'd be where I am today.
Great. So I want to start off really by asking about the client briefing, really, because there can be sort of in some search organizations, there can be sort of a firewall between researchers and associates, and that can have, I guess, an impact on the search. So a key part of the executive search process is really telling the story of the client and the opportunity, and much of this information is gathered at the briefing. So how important is it for the researcher to be at that client briefing? Vishnu, maybe you can take that to start with.
Sure, I'd love to, Patrick. Thank you. Look, I'm sure you've all heard the words trusted advisor multiple times over the last couple of days. The way I see it, a researcher is an integral part of a team and therefore a trusted advisor responsible for the overall delivery of a search assignment. So to me, it's just common sense that you'd involve them right from the get-go and from the beginning of an assignment that you're involved in, because in many ways it serves to increase their stake in the final outcome and improve your firm's overall chances of success. In other words, it also clarifies for the researcher straight from the source, which is your client, if they are at that briefing, what the scope of a project is, what your key deliverables are, and most importantly, what are some of the critical issues that you might need to navigate to get to a successful outcome. So I think there's benefits, both ways. So for the consultant who's effectively fronting the project, it's good judgment to have a researcher at the client briefing, as I've just mentioned. It provides a different perspective of the opportunities and challenges. For the researcher, it also means that should they at some point wish to head down the consulting path themselves, it provides multiple opportunities to understand what a range of client engagements could look and feel like, and helps build confidence for the future. But look, that's my take. Kelly, did you have any thoughts on that?
I always have thoughts. Thank you, Vishnu. So what I would say to that is, I look at a researcher as someone who does desk research. To me, the senior associate or the executive recruiter should always be on that client intake call. And not just because the game of telephone is a dangerous one, right? They get to hear it from the first time, right from the client. It hasn't been watered down through other individuals. But what I think is really important and what I encourage with my team is have that senior associate on the call. And the reason you want that person on the call is because they have different questions. They have different insight. When you're in the market and you're asking questions, it's not the same questions generally your principal, your consultant, your managing director are asking, right? So I think it's a different perspective and it's a valuable perspective. And I think your likelihood of going back to the client later once you're in the market, it definitely goes down, right? But that's just my take on it. But I think it's critical of the senior associate or the executive recruiter be on those calls for that reason.
Interesting about different questions, and that's a good point actually. And I guess part of that is because they're involved in building that initial list, they probably have questions that are focused more around research. But is part of it also the fact that a lot of researchers and associates are of a different generation? Does that come into those different questions as well?
So I'm sure it does, but from my point of view, I think when you're an associate and you're on the phone, you're already thinking about what candidates are going to ask you, right? You're trying to get ahead of it so you know the answers. And so I think your perspective is slightly different. So I think you come at those client intake calls a little differently, and not wholly differently, right? But differently. For example, if it's a startup, right, wanting to know about funding, specific things like that. That are being asked that may not be asked initially in the client intake. So and we talked about diversity of thought when we first all logged on here, and diversity of location. diversity in just how you approach a search is important too.
Mhm.
Right.
If I can add, Patrick,
Mm.
I think it also, when you're coming together as a search team and you're working with a client and you show up to that client meeting as a team, there's something really powerful about showing that there's more than one person supporting the client to fill a gap or solve a problem. And I think just from a client service perspective, it really shows that there's more than one person who's, on the team that's working with you collaboratively to make this happen. And I think that's a very powerful stance rather than just one direct person of contact.
That's a good point, and probably particularly important if you're a relatively small boutique, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, while you've got the mic, I want to ask you really about how you prepare in advance of a candidate call, really sort of building on some of those things David Butter was talking about taking the time to consciously think about what questions you're going to ask and how the conversation's going to go.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, that session with David Butter was phenomenal. I mean, for everyone who tuned into that, I hope you take all your notes away and put them into action. I think being prepared before you have a call, especially with someone at the senior executive level, is so important. It establishes a very different rapport with your candidate. Doing the homework, understanding who that person is really important to showing them that you're committed and that you're a credible researcher or associate. And so one of the things that I think about when I think about candidates and I'm looking at a resume or a LinkedIn profile, I really look at that as like the 2D version of a candidate. And that's information that everyone has access to. And I think when you're speaking to someone at the executive level who's been around for a while, they expect you to already know that. So when you're going into a candidate call, the last thing you should be doing is filling out, whether you're doing a pre-screening call or whatever, however you manage it within your research, rather than ticking the boxes and just confirming, we really want to get to that 3D version or the very colorful version of the candidate. And you can really only do that effectively if you've already sort of pre-populated the information that you should already know. And so preparing, doing your homework. And so that can look a couple different ways. For me, I really try to take the time with a resume, looking at their LinkedIn profile, not just for their work history, but who are they connected to? And David Butter talked about this in terms of your network. Who do you know? Who do they know at the organization that you're recruiting for? What are their other interests? What are they liking? What are their comments? You can really get to know a candidate from that perspective, and then go off of our LinkedIn or the resume and Google them. You can find out really fascinating information, especially at the senior executive level. A lot of people, you'll be able to find information or context about a person just by Googling them. Some of it's relevant, some of it's not, but at least it gives you something interesting. You might find out that they're involved in a nonprofit. You might find out that they're involved, for example, a candidate that I was recently recruiting was involved with a canine unit associated with a fire and police department. And I wouldn't have known that if I didn't Google this individual. And so going into the candidate call, I already had some of those power questions ready to go where I could get a little bit deeper and I could demonstrate that I knew who this person was generally. And really what I was trying to get to was the colorful version of that person. And so I think, just to reiterate, prepare, do your research, spend the time, pre-populate all of your reports so that the time spent is super effective. You're not rehashing information you already have, but you're really building a complete whole picture of who this individual is. And that goes a long way to establishing your credibility as a recruiter, as I said, and your rapport with the candidate.
Interesting and important points. It reminds me, I mean, sometimes you can have too much information, especially if you tell the candidate, right? I remember a few years ago, we were doing a site visit for a firm that was joining the AESC, and they wanted to demonstrate, their research capability as part of that process. And so we turned up to the meeting, and one of the first things they said is, "Oh, you like Italian food and you're into cycling." So that was a little more sort of on the creepy side. side. So you can ease into these things, I guess.
Balance, right? You want to create some power questions that aren't super creepy, but then you're asking a question and listening. So you're not doing all of the talking, as hopefully you're not asking about someone's interest in Italian food.
Great. So there's lots to pack into these initial calls with candidates, and we're really often sort of simultaneously pitching the opportunity and telling the story of the client, as well as finding a little bit more about the candidate and doing some pre-screening or qualifying. And so that naturally means, you know, in terms of that preparation, there's a lot of scripts and checklists we might have, and that runs the risk of ending up, I guess, being a monologue. So Vishnu, maybe you can talk about how you move from that monologue into a dialogue with candidates.
Sure, love to. I think one of the key skills that distinguishes a good researcher or even consultant is the ability to truly listen. Often we have, the risk of some of the things that we've just talked about is that you go in with a pre-prepared agenda or list of things that you want to get through. And it's just human nature to want to prioritize what's in front of you versus the intangibles. And by that, I mean what the other person is going through or what they might be experiencing just then in that conversation or their personal circumstances, because they aren't immediately part of your own agenda. So I think by genuinely listening to the person you're approaching and staying open to conversational cues, one really starts to explore opportunities for a conversation and a dialogue, rather than risk turning it into you just pitching someone who's just totally not interested in what you've got to say. So when I think about it, when I approach a prospect for a role, I realize that they're under no obligation to buy what I'm selling. Or even give up time in their schedule to speak with me, and to effectively smooth the conversational pathway. I usually do two things. Now these aren't, they aren't rocket science by any means, but I think it's worth just teasing them out a little bit. So I typically introduce myself, the reason for my call, and I provide the benefit of doubt to the individual around, why I'm approaching them. In other words, I assume they wish to engage, except that the time at which I'm ringing them may not necessarily be the best time. I then make a time to speak with them to explore the opportunity more fully, and pay attention to the fact that I'm doing this as opposed to steamrolling them with everything I've got in our first interaction. So by doing this, I'm doing two things. I'm displaying my consideration for their time. I'm showing them that I'm willing to listen, and also I'm saying, look, I'm really willing to make time to talk when it's convenient for them, as opposed to when it's only convenient for me. Now, the second part of this is when I actually speak with a prospect, my focus is on ensuring that I really understand their current state. And part of that's informed by the amount of preparation I've done before that conversation. And I layer in my pitch during that conversation. So they appreciate the difference they can make to the client that our firm represents. And my approach typically is to use 3 words to open up the conversation further. And particularly if I find a potential candidate is not as forthcoming as I'd expect them to be. And the words I use are just tell me more. And by doing that, the person I'm speaking with feels like they are having a chance to really articulate what they're thinking through some of the material that I've just shared with them. And we're attempting to build a genuine human connection or rapport, which to me means I think we're allowing for a more balanced conversation to eventuate and develop going forward.
That's a really interesting. I mean, it's so simple, that tell me more, but it requires confidence, I think, doesn't it? Because if you're a new researcher who's been in your role for, 6 months or something, and you're talking to the CEO of your country's largest company, tell me more can be a bit of a scary thing to ask, I guess.
I think that is a good point, Patrick, but I think it's you've got to, when you're having these conversations, they're never easy at any level, I think. You've got to build in that level of confidence when you have these conversations. And, the CEO you're talking to doesn't necessarily need to know that you're only 6 months old in the organization. So I think it's up to you to effectively put on that, put on your big boy pants, as I call them, or the equivalent, and just go, look, you mean business, you're considerate in terms of their time, but you do have a point to get across, but not at the cost of listening to them. So I think having that conversation means they're going, wow, okay, this person wants to engage on equal terms, and showing that level of confidence, I think, builds confidence in turn in the prospect.
Yeah, And of course we're experts when it comes to executive search, which the candidate won't be. So yeah, that's good advice. So we currently have multiple generations of people in the workforce. So I'm interested to explore how that impacts how people communicate, particularly the use of telephone versus video versus text-based technology. So Kelly, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I want to take an approach that's a little different. I want to take the internal approach, meaning your colleagues, right? And then the external approach, meaning your candidates. I think this is kind of unprecedented. We have 4 generations in the workforce right now. We've got the baby boomer, we've got Gen X, we've got millennials, and now coming into the workforce is Gen Z, right? So, some of us weren't born with the internet. Others don't know life without it. So I think what's really important is you've got to kind of take away some of those stereotypes about those different generational differences. And we all have them, right? It's not one versus the other, but it's about how to figure out how to communicate. Now in your office, for example, you might be new to the business, a couple of years out of college, and you're working with someone who maybe always wants to pick up the phone and you just want to shoot a text message. I think it's really important to sit down and think about who you're working with and how they want to communicate. And maybe that's something you even establish at the beginning of a search, beginning of a working relationship, to really understand what's an effective way to get your point across. Because I would always recommend walking down the hall. That's not always an option. I think number 2 is picking up the phone personally. And for those quick communications, that's when you shoot a text. And then when you want a record of it, right, then it's email. But I do think it's important to establish those guidelines internally with your teams in order to effectively communicate. Because again, like I said, 4 generations in the workforce right now, and you're all doing things very differently. I think the same applies to our candidates too, right? And I think all of us know this. You put out the phone call, you put out the LinkedIn message, you put out the voicemail, the email. And one of those is going to hit. You just got to figure out which one. But I would say, think about your audience. Think about what they do for a living. If they're in sales, they're probably not looking at their LinkedIn. So just be conscious of who it is, the generation they're in, right, and the role they're in, and how they might want to communicate. I don't know if you have any thoughts on it, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head with so many different generations in the workforce. It is really challenging. And when I started my career, we didn't have smartphones. They were, plug it into the lighter. And so we come with such a range of perspectives, and really it's about our comfort zone, right? And so I think to be a really impactful recruiter, one of the things that we can do really well is to mirror whoever our client or candidate is and really pay attention to that. And you touched on it, like bang on, is that get to know what their communication style is. If you don't know, and it's a first time that you're communicating with them, we don't want to really generalize, but to some extent, we want to be astute about thinking about it, do your research, figure out who the person is, find out what you can know about them, what you can find out about them. But if you don't know, start out, for example, if you're a millennial and you're communicating with a baby boomer or a Gen X, try email or phone before you text them. And if email and phone doesn't work, then try texting or LinkedIn messaging. Try the different things, but start with the starting point of what you expect might work. And if that's not working, go to the next option of whatever technology you're using to connect with them. So be flexible, but really focus on that mirroring is what I would say.
Great. Thank you. So, most of our conversations have a very direct purpose. There's a reason for the conversation. We're trying to get information, or we're trying to talk about the opportunity, create interest in the opportunity, or updating people on something significant that's happening in the process. But one of the harder things is learning how to communicate with candidates when nothing is happening and decisions are pending. Because all sorts of things can happen in that void, and other people might be approaching candidates as well. So what are some of the best practices around communicating consistently and regularly with candidates and keeping their interest warm, and really, talking about how we communicate nothing? Sarah, maybe you can take that.
Yeah, this is such a good question, and it's so important. I mean, we deal with this all the time. All the recruiters on the call, you're dealing with this all the time. Either you're keeping someone warm because they're not, the top 5 candidates or top 3 candidates, but you never know. This market is crazy, right? You might think that top candidate is a shoo-in, they're going to take the job, and at the 11th hour they pull out, they've got another opportunity. And so, these things happen all the time. We need to keep people warm all the time. And so how do we do that? I always come from a place of transparency. When I'm talking to a candidate, I want to let them know why it might be a pause. If I'm keeping them warm because they're not top candidates, I will position it differently, saying, the search committee is still deliberating, but I do connect with them. And if I've had a conversation with them, I'm having another conversation with them in the same way that we communicated previously. And so that, touches on our last comment about what technology or what venue or which way we communicate with people. So I'm using the same way. If I've had a call with somebody, then I'm calling them live. I always leave a conversation letting them know when I will call them next to check in with an update. And if the update is, we're still deliberating, or the search committee's on vacation, we're holding right now, I will have that call and let them know that. But my purpose of the call is to keep them warm, obviously, but I also want to find out, are they pursuing other opportunities? Are they still interested in this opportunity? If they're in final stages with another opportunity, and I know that this is a top candidate for the client, I'm going to reach out to the client and let them know that this is what's happening. So I think this is about providing that extra layer of value to our clients so that they can react if there is something happening, if there is that possibility. But also, it's that extra level of relationship building with our candidates to keep them warm and to keep them connected to the process.
And I'd like to chime one thing there. What I would say to all of you here is, you've all been a candidate at some point. And I would challenge you to think about that experience. And if it was a good experience, think how it made you feel. And if it wasn't a good experience, think about that, right? And what I'm saying is put yourself in that candidate's shoes and treat them how you'd want to be treated. And I think, you'll find you'll have more successful outcomes.
If I could just add to that as well, great points by both Sarah and Kelly. I think the other thing to remember is, you can never communicate enough with your candidates, right? So I don't believe there's such a thing as over communication. There is such a thing as under communication, but in this instance, we're talking about making sure you stay on top of things. Also, please remember that a number of these candidates could potentially go on to be future clients. So I think making sure that you stay connected to them and treat them with respect and courtesy during this part of the process is going to be just as important as any other part of the process. And in many cases, from personal experience, we've actually gone on to develop as a firm really good relationships with people who've been unsuccessful in searches that we've run, but that's a testament to our ability to build those relationships despite the fact that they were unsuccessful, and we've gone on to work with them separately. So you never know where some of those opportunities could come from. So remember to treat people with respect, and especially this part of the process, stay well connected and keep them posted on how things are going.
Great point.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your virtual hand or put those in the chat. So we've got 10 minutes left, so we'll try to answer some of those. But in the meantime, I want to really explore Zoom conversations a bit more. And so I think that's one thing that's changed from the pandemic. They're probably here to stay more than they were beforehand. But we have reports from members in different parts of the world of candidates not really taking a Zoom interview with the same degree of seriousness that they would take a face-to-face conversation or even a telephone conversation. So people turning up late or wearing inappropriate clothing and all sorts of things. Kelly, I want to ask you, how do you manage Zoom fatigue and ensure that candidates take video conversations seriously?
Look, this is a tough one, and I'm sure we all have some stories to share here. But what I do think is important, just how you would prep a candidate for an in-person interview, you should prep them for a phone interview, and you should prep them for a Zoom interview. And I would liken a Zoom interview no different than being in person. They should be conscious of what they wear, albeit from the waist up. They should be very conscious of their background. That's very distracting. They should also close doors, get kids out of the room, right? All those things that we've been saying, but we've become very lax over the last couple of years since COVID. I think, they really need to take it seriously and remove distractions and treat this just as they would treat something in person. You're not getting the same thing out of it. It's not the same, obviously, but it's your first impression. And your first impression on video is far more impactful than your impression on the phone. And then your impression in person is an even different one, right? So I would advise and I would counsel the very same things I just said. My background, it's so boring, it looks fake, right? But that's deliberate, it's by design. And, there's nothing behind my computer, there's a wall, so I'm not distracted. And those are all the same pieces of advice you should give a client. And a candidate. And one thing that they do struggle with is talking to that camera. And I think that's something one needs to practice with. That's something one needs to be comfortable with. So look, they're not used to interviewing all the time like you are. So for you, it's to some degree second nature. So I think you kind of got to put yourself back in those shoes, think about those key points and counsel on them, just like you would prep for an in-person interview. Vishnu and Sarah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I completely agree. I think, Zoom fatigue is a thing. And I think we've experienced it at many levels, both through, us, through interviews we run and clients telling us that, they've come to the end of their respective tethers, just, they're done with it. But you've got to remember that while you do lose a percentage of your ability to understand or to understand what goes into making someone tick via Zoom, you've got to make the best of it. And I think those tips that you just heard from Kelly, I think are worth their weight in gold. I think the important thing to remember always is that no two people will approach a conversation on Zoom the same way. So it doesn't hurt to go over some of those tips, before you have some of these conversations, so people are on the same page when you have those conversations, and they can be as productive and they can give of their, the best versions of themselves as they possibly can.
Great. And Sarah, one of the more challenging conversations to have with candidates is really talking about compensation. Do you have any tips around that?
It's an interesting perspective if you think of it as a challenging conversation or if it's just a part of your advisor duties. I think, here in Canada, and in our practice, we identify the salary range that the client has set for the role, and we communicate that right up front and in almost every touch point thereafter. And we also have them, communicate in a disclosure statement to confirm that they acknowledge the salary range. And we do that so that we don't get to a final interview and a candidate says, "I didn't know that the pay was so low," or whatever it is. So we try to be prepared to offset that. I think that transparency piece reduces some of those challenging conversations. There are often times that a candidate will identify that the salary range is too low and that they're not interested in the opportunity. And so that really gives us an opportunity to go back to our client and communicate that some of the candidates they really like may or may not be thinking that the salary range is too low. And it gives our client really, we're providing the advisor relationship to let them know what our candidates are saying or communicating to us. It's not our responsibility or have control over our clients' operating budgets or compensation packages. So I don't think it's a difficult conversation for us to have. We're really, we can only advise them of what the candidates are reporting and really what our clients are communicating they can do. So, if there are opportunities for a client to go back and have an operating budget or a higher salary range offered, then that is that's within their scope of control, not ours. So when I think, is it a challenging conversation? I don't think of it as a challenging conversation because I'm an advisor. I'm communicating information from one side to the other. I think it's a valuable piece of the puzzle. And as long as you continue to focus on that service-oriented approach of your advisor relationship with your clients and your candidates, I think you're really just disseminating information. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Just want to go back to I guess we've talked about telephone calls and we've talked about video calls and we've talked about them as separately. But how do you balance the two? I mean, when would you decide to use a telephone call versus a video call? And I think, this current environment we're in, we rely very heavily on video, but there's still some value, I think, to telephone conversations. So, Kelly, perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
So I think there's a ton of value in phone calls. And I'll say why I go to the phone call first is because there's no technical difficulties. No one has trouble logging on. There's no sound issues. I mean, we're all still experiencing it, right? A few years into the whole change in the world. I do think the phone call is great, and it's because there are no distractions. I talked about distractions earlier, right? When you're on a Zoom call, when you're on the phone, you're just focusing on that person. Theoretically, that person's just focusing on you. I love to make my first piece of outreach a phone call. And I don't know how all of you feel. I don't know if everybody wants to put a hand up if you like that or not, but that's what I recommend. I think when you go into that next phone call, when you're doing that deeper dive, the Zoom call, Teams, whatever it is you use, I think that's a lovely transition because you get to see how the person presents. You get to see the person's mannerisms because it does matter, right? You need to understand who you're presenting potentially to a client, just like you need to understand your client and you're presenting them, when they meet with your candidate, as the previous discussion. But I don't know. I think I personally get more out of that first outreach being a phone call because it does remove the distractions. I do recommend that being the first way to do your outreach. I know maybe some of you are doing it via email, but that's just a quick back and forth. But your true, 30-minute deep dive that you can possibly do in 30 minutes, I think is most valuable and most productive for both sides of the conversation over the phone. I'd love to hear from anyone on the call here, their thoughts on that particular topic.
It's a good thought, actually. And maybe people can write that in the chat. What is generally your first method of outreach with the candidate? Is it a phone call? Is it video call? Is it some form of text-based messaging? So perhaps if people could write that in the chat, that would be interesting.
And there are no wrong answers. Texting is okay too, Lynn. You have to know your audience. Sometimes you do have to text. You don't do it often, but when it's necessary, you go that route. Yeah.
If I can add, I agree with Kelly, always starting out on the phone. And one of the reasons I love that, in addition to everything that Kelly shared, is, we all have these inherent biases when we're communicating with people. And I think having a phone conversation can remove some of those inherent biases that we're trying to, address in some of our processes. And so having a conversation and really being able to focus on the words and not the way someone looks is, I think, a great way to do that.
And everyone's saying email and LinkedIn, and I agree with that. I'm talking more so when you have that first introductory conversation, not just trying to schedule that. But I do agree, email and LinkedIn are a great place to start. I do recommend the phone after that, and then of course a Zoom call or a Teams call. And then, of course, as Lynn suggested, peppering in text when appropriate. You've got to know your audience. You've got to know the audience that will be more responsive. Again, think about the different generations, and then you can create your approach from there.
Brilliant. And I think that's a really good point about removing the distractions. I know often when I'm speaking to someone for the first time and I don't know them, and if they're talking in front of a bookshelf, I find myself like looking at all the titles of their books because I'm interested to see what they're reading, and then I sort of lose the train of conversation. So it's a good point. That doesn't happen on the telephone. You just
No, it means you're
focused
curious
on
by
them.
nature, and that's a great thing, but it also is a distraction, right?
Yeah. Lynn, you had a question before about a quick tip. Maybe we can direct that towards Vishnu first. So if you can talk about that, Lynn.
Do you want me to just ask? So Vishnu,
Sure.
my question is, it just occurred to me, being a, let's say, lifelong sales professional. Yeah, I've come to the AESC as a managing director, but I have many years of sales. I won't name the number. And my quest has always been never, ever, ever to sound salesy, because it's a put off. I don't like being sold when it's obvious. I like people to kind of talk with me, and before you know it, I'm saying yes. That's how I want to come across. But in the interactions that you have as a recruiter, an executive recruiter, where you're talking to the not actively looking, how do you avoid not sounding salesy, with the pitch and how do you avoid that?
Yeah, I think, Lynn, that's a great question, and I love the way you verbalize that. I think in our line of work, I think sounding salesy can be an occupational hazard, but the fact remains that it's the way you approach it. What I told myself relatively early on when I started out in my career here was just thinking about the fact that I'm potentially going to discuss something that could be life-changing for the person that I'm speaking with. And to me, when I think about it that way, and that I channel that through my conversation, it becomes more of a conversation and a dialogue. Yeah. And I approach that with no expectations whatsoever. I mean, the pressure, we put pressure on ourselves. We're really good at putting ourselves under pressure. We've got targets to meet. We've got clients to satisfy. We've got to do this. We've got to do that. But in that moment, when you're talking with somebody else who's never heard your voice before, they don't really care what's going on in your world. So, but you make it your business to care about what's important to them. And that's how you start the conversation. So to me, the actual pitch around what I'm trying to get across, to me, is secondary. I think that the initial part is trying to build rapport. And it could be something as simple as talking about the weather. It could be something as simple as, hey, we spotted something. We were looking at your LinkedIn page and spotted something, and it may be something of mutual interest. It may be something that gets the wheels turning. But obviously you don't have forever to get to make your point. But my point here is the fact that you don't start with a pitch. You try and socialize what you're trying to talk about by putting it in a context that could be potentially enriching for the person that you're speaking with. And you build that up through practice. And by genuinely wanting to understand the other person's point of view, rather than encapsulating yourself within your own little world of targets and agendas that you need to complete or meet. Does that help?
Brilliant. It does. It's quite different when you say you're about to change. You could change their lives. That's what makes all the difference. It could change their lives, their families' lives. Everything about their ecosystem, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of perspective. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for that. Brilliant.
Great. And Sarah, Kelly, Vishnu, I don't know if you have any final comments. And remember, if anyone in the audience has a comment or a question, put up your virtual hand or write it in the chat. We're almost at time.
And Patrick, I'm going to initiate a poll, a rapid 2-question poll, just
Great.
about the whole session. So after, just let me know when I can do that.
Okay, well, might as well put that up now, Lynn.
Yep. Oh, wait, Kelly.
No, I was just going to say thank you to everyone for your time today and allowing Vishnu, Sarah, and I'm not speaking on their behalf, but to come speak to you. I hope you found this valuable. I would also encourage any of you, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Always happy to foster new researchers, new associates in the business. I think it's really important to have mentors in the business and people you can reach out to ask questions. I think it's important.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kelly. And I've said this all along, this whole session, that what's great about what we're doing is that it covers all areas. And on this call alone, we have senior people, we have junior people. We have just a mix of experiences rather, and that's very exciting. We can learn from each other. It's like that multi-generational workforce that you spoke of earlier.
Absolutely.
Oh, we have a hand raised.
Yeah, Laurie, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a quick question. Sorry, I know.
No.
Thank you to everyone. I just had a question around, since we're spending all this time building rapport and trust with the candidates, as you all spoke about, so intentionally, and I really appreciate that. How do you also balance then the expectations of the client? Because you're trying to also represent the candidate since you've built that trust with them, and balancing that expectation of the clients, especially in these new environments where even Sarah had mentioned you're approaching them, but they might be getting other opportunities knocking at their door. So maybe some insight into that would be helpful too. Thanks.
Who wants to take that one?
Sarah,
it looks like you're raring
yeah.
to go.
Yeah, you know, I think my perspective or my goal is to always identify the right person with the right fit. I'm filling a gap, I'm solving a problem, and my candidate relationships I'm looking at as you know, Vishnu and Kelly mentioned, these are long-term relationships that may not transpire to a client relationship in the near term, but the long term, or we may have another search that they're a great candidate for. So I want to really be clear that they're a candidate that I want to have in my database, whether they land the job or not. It's a great connection. Whether they're a fit for the particular role that I'm recruiting for at that time is the question, and that's really translates over to the other side of communicating with the client, you know, understanding what the requirements are of the job, what they're most interested in terms of interpersonal skills, what the right fit is. And if your perspective is that you're the advisor from both perspectives and that it's about fit, I think it's a different perspective than trying to manage them all perfectly in tandem. I think it's really about making the connections. You're a matchmaker, right? Like you're trying to find, you know, the best woman for your brother to date or whatever, right? Like it's kind of that idea that you're a matchmaker, and is it the right match? And if it's not, that's okay. You know, you might be able to find the right match for them later. Is that Kelly?
I think that's perfectly well said. You know, I think that's something most candidates at the level we're working at understand. I think when you go to the mid-level, that you might have to explain that this might not be the right opportunity, but there are future ones. And what often happens in our organization is, you know, we'll have someone and we'll say they're not exactly what you're looking for, but we think you should meet them. And then they often get hired for different positions. So I think it's important to just keep that rapport, if not for today, for tomorrow, for another search, and if not for tomorrow, think about them as a client. So you've got two clients in that instant, right? The one that you're working for and the one that might be your future client. So you just got to make sure that rapport is a 360 kind of scenario, which I know is easier said than done.
Wow.
Great. And Emily, sorry to call on you to do some public speaking, but perhaps you mentioned a comment in the chat. If you could just tell the group so they see that, that'd be great. If you're still online.
It's a great book that she mentioned by Daniel Pink. There she goes.
Let me give up video too. I'm just getting myself. I'm multitasking. Yeah, I do. I read quite a bit, and I highly recommend Daniel Pink if you haven't read Drive or his more recent ones, To Sell is Human. Fantastic. It's such a good perspective. And I think us as leadership consultants, I agreed with Vishnu, is that I'm not trying to shove a square peg in a round hole at each time. I'm really honest and upfront and as transparent as possible. And I think people appreciate hearing pros and cons. I think, honestly, the more warts I can share, because we've done our homework up front, we've had really great client and stakeholder interviews, and really know the organization, and hence why you end up having long-term clients that work with you for 20 plus years, or, you know, for division presidents and beyond, is that they trust you. It's a partnership. And that when you're talking to individuals, everyone's human and you really can transform. I said it in my comment, not only can you have the power to transform yourself, taking over a CEO opportunity, but you have the power to transform a company, whether that's increased growth or to impact an industry. I work in a really small niche industry where I've seen companies, go from 250 million to $1 billion with the right person in place because they didn't know or have that before. So it's really exciting. I really related to what you were saying, Vishnu, in particular. Yeah.
Definitely.
Very cool.
Brilliant. Well,
Yeah.
we're over time now, so I really want to thank Kelly, Sarah, and Vishnu for joining us today. I think it's a really insightful panel. I knew it was going to be when we had our planning call. Usually we have 4 people on these panels, and we had the planning call, and I thought, actually, no, 3 is fine. These people are great. So you didn't disappoint. Lots of valuable insight and practical tips. So thank you so much for joining us. And
shall I launch the poll?
Yeah, Lynn, I'll hand over to you to close and say a few words and do that poll.
Okay, a few words, definitely. It's been great to see this cross-regional, actually global participation. And we're just so inspired that, here at the AESC, what we do is, our mission is to strengthen leadership worldwide. And we do that one step at a time with the right training, education, peer-to-peer knowledge, connection, all of that's so critical for you to keep you where you need to be. So thank you for helping us do that and for adding value to this forum. So we truly appreciate it. I'm going to launch the poll now because we want to get your feedback. We always want to keep improving. So here we go. There's just 3 quick questions, if you could. Do you see it yet? I hope. Okay. Don't feel shy about.
No one can see how you vote, so it's
right.
fine.
Right. Feedback is how we improve. So. Yes, when I know, so we're about 60%. So when I get to, so 23 of you have responded. Let's see, we're almost there. Just need 10 more respondents possible. Fantastic, coming. So yeah, all right, great. We have 77% of you. And thank you for those of you who said you would be a part of a focus group. The challenge there is that we didn't ask your name. So we're going to be sending around a survey just so that you can, or you could put your name in the chat right now if you want to. I don't want to put you to work, but we will be following up because focus groups are very helpful in planning agendas and making the training and the topics relevant. So, thank you, TM. Thank you, Catherine. Great. And Emma, I hope you're capturing. Fantastic. I think we have 80%. So fantastic. I think we're there. Unless there's anyone else. Okay, I'm going to stop because we've got 80% participation. That's 82. Okay, let's give it one more second here. I think we're good.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And Emma, if you could capture, I hope you can. I'm going to end the poll. Great. There we go. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. I imagine we'll end this session.
Yeah, and that's the end of the whole forum. So thank you for joining, and hopefully you got something out of it, and appreciate feedback however you give it. So feel free to email us. Talk to you
Take
later.
care, everyone.
See you.
Thanks
Bye.
very much,
Bye.
Patrick, Lynn,
Bye.
Sarah, Kelly. Fantastic.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.